This is a lecture for History 156, American Sexualities, delivered by me, Gary Ralph. I was talking in the lecture that I just finished recording a minute ago about how the geographic areas in a large town in the 19th century were not socially distinct in the way they had been before. And one of the things that you see happening is that businesses, establishments that were not necessarily intended to cater to the upper class or middle class begin appearing in, for instance, the business districts of town where only middle class people who worked in offices, middle class men, would be going to the downtown parts of town. Women would not be going there, and generally speaking, the lower class, the working class, would not be going downtown to do anything. But now you begin to see these establishments that are sometimes called dance halls, that are located downtown, but that are not meant to be patronized by the same kind of people who had their jobs or did their business in the downtown area. These are the people who go to these dance halls are people who would be considered working class, but who were out for a good time, and they were out for entertainment. There was a typical stereotyped character in the 19th century called the Bowery boy or the Bowery girl. The Bowery was a street which still exists actually in New York City, and it was considered to be a place where disreputable people hung out and disreputable things took place. And one of the things that happened was that these dance halls became centers of social activity for these lower class people. The things that happened in the dance halls were not necessarily illegal things. Illegal things might have gone on, but the main reason that upper class people objected to them was that the kind of social activities and the kind of entertainments that took place in dance halls were not considered to be respectable. I mean, respectable people would go to a theater where some recognized actor would be performing a Shakespeare play or something like that. The lower class people, the working class people, such as the Bowery boys and Bowery girls, would be going to these dance halls where the entertainment was, women in scanty clothing doing provocative dances, people singing songs with lyrics that had vulgar references. And one of the important differences between dance halls and the places of entertainment that upper class people went to is that the audience, the customers, were being served alcohol during the performances. This had been the case earlier in the 1700s, but a lot of theaters had decided to clean up their act and be more respectable. So they had stopped serving alcohol, but in the dance halls that continued to take place. And also there was a kind of mixing between the people who were on stage and the people who were in the audience. Very often after the performance, the actors and performers who had been on stage would serve as waitresses and come down and mingle with the crowd, which was not considered to be respectable. And the dance halls were places where single people, a Bowery boy might go to meet a Bowery girl, because unlike the so-called civilized high-toned theater, there was a lot of social interaction between the customers. You could, if you saw somebody that you thought looked interesting, it was not unacceptable to go over to their table and try to start a conversation with them, much like bars are today, where people go to pick somebody up. And one of the results of this was that the line between prostitution and proper behavior became a little blurred. These people who went to the dance halls did not have a lot of money. Sometimes there was a charge for admission, a cover charge, as there often is in bars, or at least there were in bars where I was going when I was of an age to do that. So people who were women, for instance, who were going to a dance hall by themselves might be looking for somebody who would be willing to bear part of the expenses of the entertainment. even in the 20th century among proper people, it was considered proper for a man, if a man wanted to, quote, take a woman out, he was supposed to pay for the expenses of the evening. And women who, as I pointed out earlier, were often not making enough money even to meet their normal living expenses, might go to these dance halls hoping that they would meet a man who would be able to pay for the expenses at least of that evening, and the man might pay for those expenses, but with the expectation that he would be getting something out of it too, usually in terms of the woman being willing to engage in sexual activity. Now, is this prostitution? It's very hard to say. Certainly the woman did not always go to the dance hall with the idea, I'm going to sell my body and make money that way. Sometimes it was not even something that she was thinking about before she went to the dance hall. But in some ways, the transaction was an exchange of sexual favors for financial support, which, that's not one bad definition of prostitution. Actually, many people who were defending women who behave this way were saying that's very often why a woman marries a man, because she's looking for financial support. And she's assuming that as this man's wife, she's going to be having sex with him. There may be other things going on, but there is a sense in which legitimate legal marriage is a financial transaction on something of the same basis. So people were beginning to have this uncomfortable feeling that the boundaries between good behavior and bad behavior were being blurred. The boundaries between neighborhoods where things like that, bad things could be expected to take place, and good areas, such as really the areas that many of these dance halls were located in, you couldn't really count on the fact that just because you were in a dance hall, all of the women that you met were going to behave in a socially acceptable way, nor could you count on the fact that these women would be behaving in such a way that you could treat them as prostitutes. So this upset a lot of people, and one of the things that happened is that in a lot of cities, you have the government setting up areas within which it is legal to practice prostitution. These areas came to be known as red light districts for reasons that remain unclear. One of the possibilities is that the lanterns that were used to light these neighborhoods, of course they didn't have electricity yet, the lanterns that were used had panes of red glass in them so that the lights were literally red. The idea being that the kinds of things that were going on in the red light district were not necessarily things that people would feel comfortable being seen by other people as doing. So if the light was red instead of a bright white or yellow, you would be less likely to be seen by other people in the district that you didn't want to be seen by. But in any case, you have these areas of town that are often specified by city legislation. South of this street, west of this street, east of that street, north of that street, there is this block where prostitution is okay. And of course, once that is determined, respectable people are not going to want to live in that area anymore. And it becomes a situation where, once again, as in many cases you had before the 19th century, you have a neighborhood in town where bad things are known to take place. But the neighborhood is often right in the middle of the city. It's not necessarily something where, respectable men and women who are going about their daily duties would be unlikely to go into. Instead, it's a place that is known to these people as a place they have to avoid. So by the end of the 19th century, you have a lot of areas in the big cities, in practically every big city actually, where it is legally okay to practice prostitution. And that's interesting because the people who lived in that city, who were objecting to prostitutes, who didn't think that they were morally upstanding people, instead they were people that you wanted to avoid, didn't really necessarily try to get rid of them. A lot of people said, you got to have prostitutes. There's always been prostitutes. It's just one of those things that goes on. But we don't want to have to look at them. We don't want to have to walk through the neighborhoods where they live. So if we can specify legally a part of town where the prostitutes live and then just stay away from that area, unless you actually want to do business with a prostitute, then that will be a convenient way of making the city safe for decent, upstanding, upper-class people to walk around. They just know to not go into these areas. Some of the areas become quite famous. And one of them is a part of New Orleans called Storyville. It was called this sarcastically because the man who was responsible for setting up the legislation was named Story, the legislation that would confine prostitution to these areas. Excuse me. Storyville has become important in the cultural history of the United States because it is regarded as one of the areas where the musical form known as jazz evolved. Jazz is generally regarded as being African American, although there are certainly many important white jazz musicians. But, and now it's considered to be one of the great contributions to world culture that the United States has made. But I remember even in my childhood, and certainly when my mom was growing up as a musician in the 30s and 40s, that jazz was considered to be not a respectable kind of music to play or to listen to. And today we look back at those statements of abhorrence and indignation about jazz. What's wrong with jazz? We associate it with composers like George Gershwin, Rhapsody in Blue. But the reason that people in the 20s and 30s were disapproving of jazz was that they knew where jazz had come from. It had come from areas like Storyville, where black musicians would perform in the brothels where madams did their business, met their customers, and therefore it was a kind of music that was culturally tainted. By the way, there were a lot of black people who worked in Storyville, either as prostitutes or as musicians and entertainers, but black men did not go there as customers. Storyville was a place that existed in order that white men could take advantage of the opportunity to have sex with women of various nationalities. But one of the things that ends up being so alarming to the people who disapprove even of this restricted form of prostitution is that, among other things, it makes it possible for white men to have sex with black women. Not to marry them, not to form civil relationships with them that would have social approval, but it enables them to have that interracial contact that wouldn't have been acceptable in the outside world. And I will explain more about this in a minute, but first I have to stop this tape again and go clear my throat. I'll be back in a minute.